One of the questions that I wish people ask me more often is, hey, Azul, how much am I likely going to be spending in retirement? As a fee-only financial advisor for over 20 years, I probably get asked over 100 times a year, how much money do I need to save for retirement? But I only get asked a handful of times, how should I think about my expenses? And obviously the two are linked and have a big impact on one another. And if you end up estimating that you're going to be spending way more than you likely are, you know what that means? You're going to spend years longer working to save up money that you're not going to need. I don't want that to happen to you. And conversely, if you don't estimate enough, you may retire and unwittingly put yourself at risk because you didn't budget enough. So it's a really important question, and in today's video, we're going to talk about it. Let's go for a walk. I think one of the reasons that people don't ask this question more often is that there's a very common rule of thumb that says you're going to spend 80% in retirement compared to what you spent when you were working. But the question is that a good rule of thumb? And fortunately, we don't have to guess as to whether it's a good rule of thumb, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics every year puts out a consumer expenditure study. And 2022's data just came out in October of 23, shortly before this video. So we've got recent data and we can look at it. And fortunately, the Bureau of Labor Statistics breaks it out by age group. So we can see what happens as people age. And they're in different age groups. And what are they spending for housing and transportation and food? And overall, what's their total budgets? Okay, so I'm going to put a link in the study where you can see the Bureau of Labor Statistics report for yourself. And it's crazy. They have, how much people spend on beef and pork and chicken and eggs and just about everything you can imagine, gasoline. So it's a really, really informative report. Okay, but let's jump into the expenses. So overall, 45 to 54-year-olds in America are spending $91,074 a year. That seems high to me, but that's what the data shows. And then 55 to 64 years old, it's $78,079 a year. I should say these are per household. So there's somebody in that household that's 45 to 54. There's somebody in the household that's 55 to 64. And then 65 plus, it goes down to $57,818. So now let's do the math, right? So it peaked out 45 to 54, people were spending just over $90,000. So when you're 55 to 64, and some of those people are retired, that drops down to the $78,000. So that's 85% of the $91,000. And how does it compare for the 65 pluses, where a lot of people are starting to retire at that age? So the almost 58,000 to 57,818 is 63.5% of what a 45 to 54-year-old is spending. So that's from the peak. But what does it look like? A lot of people are going to work till they're 65. In the US, the average man works to 65. Now that's gone up, unfortunately, through the years, and that's because it's getting harder and harder to save money. Life is getting more expensive. The average woman now retires at 62. That used to be about 59. So both of those are creeping up. So what is the percent that 65-year-olds are spending of the 55 to 64-year-olds? Remember, again, the numbers are $57,800 for a 65-year-old per year. And for a 55 to 64-year-old, that's $78,079. And so that is 74% that the 65-year-old is spending compared to the 55 to 64. So for a 65-year-old, it's 63.5% versus peak, which happens to people 45 to 54. And it's 74.1% of what it was compared to the age group previously. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, I want to point something out. These are household numbers. These are not individual numbers, which is why they probably seem high. Now, if the survey's done and you happen to live in your home by yourself, then that is an individual, but it's households. And on average, the average household has over 2 people in it. And many of these households have 2 people working. So that's why these numbers seem high. Okay, let's keep going. And where I think this is relevant for us is what can you do to budget your expenses so that you can better project what your budget's going to be? And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I want to give you some more data before I go there. And just on some big expenses, right? Our cost of housing, transportation, and importantly, healthcare. Let me start with healthcare, because many of us are going to qualify for Medicare when we turn 65. But does that really mean that our overall healthcare expenditures are going to go down? You would think they would, but you know what? That's not what the study shows. So 45 to 54-year-olds are spending $6,100 a year for the household. 55 to 64 are spending $6,699. 65 to 74 is spending $7,422. And 75 plus is spending $7,708 a year. So what we see is what we're going to have to spend in healthcare, unfortunately, doesn't go down, even with Medicare, right? Medicare doesn't cover everything, and there are some co-pays and other expenses. In fact, Fidelity would say that the average 65-year-old couple is looking at over $300,000 in medical expenses after the age of 65, above and beyond what Medicare covers. So that's a big thing to include in your budget, is what healthcare is going to cost. And don't assume it's going to be very, very low. Yeah, you have to make up your own mind. I should say, none of this is financial advice. I just want to put these things like the availability of this data on your radar screen. I do encourage you to work with a fee-only financial advisor or an accountant that can know your specific situation and give you advice on your specific situation. Okay, so we talked about healthcare. What about housing? You know, the nice news is by the time we're 65 years old, 77% of people own their homes. And of that 47 percentage points have no mortgage, and 30 percentage points still has a mortgage, right? So 30% has a mortgage, 47% has no mortgage. That adds up to 77, and the other 23% are renting. One of the secrets, if you can do it, I know it's not easy, particularly with interest rates where they are now and housing costs where they are. If there's any way to pay off that mortgage before you retire, you're really going to thank yourself in the future if you can make that happen. Okay, let's keep going. Transportation. And this includes things like vehicles, the cost of the vehicle, the maintenance, the gasoline, all of that. And the good news there, unlike healthcare, is the cost does go down. And I think part of the reason for that is many people that are 45 to 54, you know, we might have kids at home and maybe we're helping them out with their car payment. Kids that are 16, 17, 18, whatever, mom and dad probably need their own cars as well. So, you know, it's not unusual for a family of four to have four cars as you're approaching empty nest days, but you're not quite there yet. So what does the data show? On transportation, again, it peaks out at about 45 to 54, right? That's when you're at your peak earning years. You might be driving a nicer car. Your job might require that. Or, you know, you've driven an older car your whole life. You're making good money, 45 to 54. And you're like, you know what? I'm going to treat myself to a nice car. So the transportation cost goes from $15,600 a year for the household down to $8,100. And I think one of the things that drives that is sometimes people cut back to one car. Now, I do have thoughts on this, and that is, you know what's more expensive than splurging and having a second car so both you and your spouse can have your total freedom? Yes, it's an expense, but I would say it's an investment, because you know what's more expensive than having that second car? It's getting a divorce. And it's cheap therapy, it's cheap insurance to keep your relationship strong. So if you can afford it, most people, I think, are better served having two cars if there's two of them in a partnership or a marriage. Okay, so hopefully you found that helpful. And I know that you're going to find this video up here helpful, where I talk about the other end of the equation, where I talk about how much money do you need if you want to spend $5,000 a year in retirement, $10,000 a year in retirement, or $15,000 a year in retirement. So talks about the other end of the equation, the savings needed to support your lifestyle. You'll find that video here. It's one of my more popular and more recent videos. I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you in there. Bye-bye.